The cold was a physical thing, a beast with teeth and claws. It gnawed at Alara's fingers, turning them into clumsy, useless things. It bit at her cheeks until they were numb and raw. The splintery wood of the log she carried dug into the thin fabric of her tunic, a constant, abrasive reminder of her place. She was nothing. An omega. The lowest of the low in the Stone Fang pack. Her parents had been outsiders, taken in out of some misplaced pity by the old alpha, and when they had vanished into a blizzard just like the one brewing now, that pity had curdled into contempt. Alara, their only child, inherited that contempt like a cursed heirloom. She was a ghost in her own home, visible only when someone needed a floor scrubbed, a fire tended, or a burden carried. Worthless, invisible, alone. The wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed the emptiness in her own chest. It sliced through the trees, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the heavy promise of a winter storm that would bury the world. She adjusted the load of firewood on her back, the rough bark scraping her skin. Every muscle screamed. She had been hauling wood since before sunrise, and the meager piece of stale bread she'd been allowed for breakfast had long since burned away into a hollow ache in her stomach. A laugh, sharp and cruel as broken glass, cut through the wind's song. Look at it, scurrying like a rat. Alara's shoulders hunched instinctively. She did not need to look to know who it was. Lyra. Daughter of the current alpha, beautiful, cruel, and the architect of Alara's daily miseries. Is the wood too heavy for you, little mouse? Lyra's voice was laced with mock sympathy. She stood with her friends, all of them wrapped in thick, luxurious furs, their faces flushed with warmth and superiority. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the path to the main lodge, her jaw tight. Don't answer. Don't give her the satisfaction. Lyra stepped directly into her path, a predator blocking the escape route of her prey. I asked you a question, filth. Alara flinched at the word. It was the one they all used. It was the one she sometimes whispered to herself in the dark, cold shed she called a room. No, she whispered, the sound stolen by the wind. It is not too heavy. Lyra's smile was a thin, vicious line. She nudged a loose stone on the path with the toe of her elegant boot. Oops. Alara saw it coming, but her cold, numbed feet couldn't react in time. Her boot caught the stone, and the world tilted. She cried out, not in pain, but in frustration as the carefully stacked firewood went scattering across the snow-dusted ground. She landed hard on her hands and knees, the impact jarring up her arms. Sharp, stinging pain flared in her palms as tiny splinters embedded themselves in her skin. Humiliation burned hotter than the cold, a poison flush rising up her neck. Laughter erupted from Lyra's friends. It felt like stones being thrown at her. So clumsy, Lyra tisked, looking down at Alara with disdain. Now you'll have to gather it all again. And do it quickly. The Alpha King's envoy is expected before the storm hits. We can't have the place looking like a hovel, can we? The Alpha King. The name was a legend, a myth whispered in hushed, awed tones. Supreme leader of all the packs, a being of ancient power who lived in a frozen citadel far to the north. His envoys were rare, their visits a sign of immense importance, and she was on her hands and knees in the dirt in front of them. Pick it up, Lyra commanded, her voice dropping the pretense of amusement and hardening into steel. Alara gritted her teeth, the taste of blood filling her mouth where she'd bitten her cheek. With trembling, raw fingers, she began to gather the scattered logs. Each movement was an agony of cold and shame. She would not cry. She would not. She pushed the humiliation down, packing it away into that hard, hidden place inside her where she kept all the pain. She would endure this. She had endured worse. She would endure tomorrow and the day after that. Surviving was the only form of defiance she had left. Lyra and her friends eventually grew bored and wandered off, their laughter trailing behind them like a foul scent. Alara finished gathering the wood, her hands bleeding sluggishly, the cold so deep it felt like it was freezing her very marrow. She delivered the wood, deposited it by the great hearth in the lodge where others were already soaking in its warmth, and retreated to the shadows, invisible once more. Later, as the sky turned a bruised purple and the first thick flakes of snow began to fall, the Alpha summoned her. Not Lyra's father, but his beta, a grim-faced male named Fendrel, who looked at her as if she were something he'd scraped off his boot. "The last of the winter wolfsbane needs to be gathered from the eastern ridge," he grunted, not meeting her eyes. "Lyra says you know the spot." A lie. Lyra was the one who practiced with the pack healer. Alara knew nothing of herbs, and the eastern ridge. It was a treacherous climb even in good weather. In a blizzard like this, it was a death sentence. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the numb wall she had built around her heart. This wasn't just cruelty. This was an execution. "But the storm," she began, her voice barely a whisper. Fendrel's eyes snapped to hers, cold and flat. "The pack has needs. Are you refusing a direct order, Omega?" The threat was clear. Refusal meant a public beating, or being cast out into the storm anyway, but with the brand of a traitor. At least this way, there was a sliver of a chance. A lie, but one she had to cling to. "No," she said, her voice hollow. "I will go." He thrust a thin, worn cloak and a small, empty satchel at her. It was an insult. The cloak wouldn't last 10 minutes against the teeth of this storm. She took them without a word and walked out of the lodge, away from the mocking warmth of the fire, away from the scent of roasting meat she would not taste. She walked past the stables, where the envoy's massive, silver-furred wolves were being tended to, their presence a low, rumbling thrum of power that made the air vibrate. She walked out into the waiting storm, alone. The world dissolved into a screaming vortex of white. The wind was a physical wall, pushing against her, stealing her breath, plastering her thin cloak to her body. Snow, sharp as sand, blasted against her face, and within minutes she was blind, lost. The eastern ridge was an impossibility. Now it was just about putting one foot in front of the other. Was this how her parents died? Lost and freezing in a world that had no place for them? The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. She had always imagined them finding a new life, a better one, but the truth was likely here, in the suffocating, indifferent snow. Her body was failing. The cold was no longer a sharp pain, but a deep, heavy numbness that was creeping up her limbs. Her thoughts grew sluggish, syrupy. A part of her, the part that had been fighting for so long, whispered that it would be so easy to just lie down, to sleep. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction of her death. She would not die for their convenience. She stumbled on, guided by nothing but sheer, stubborn will. She did not know how long she walked. Time had lost all meaning, measured only in the struggle for each breath. Then the ground beneath her vanished. One moment she was on solid, snow-covered earth. The next, she was falling. A sharp crack, and then the sickening lurch of gravity taking hold. She didn't even have time to scream before the impact. Ice. She had fallen onto a frozen river. The impact knocked the last of the air from her lungs, and stars exploded behind her eyes. Before she could process the pain, a second crack echoed around her, louder this time, spiderwebbing out from where she lay. The world tilted again, and with a groan of protesting ice, she plunged into the black, suffocating water below. The shock was absolute. It was a cold so profound it burned, a physical blow that seized every muscle in her body. It stole her breath, her thoughts, her will. The weight of her waterlogged cloak dragged her down, a merciless anchor pulling her into the abyss. Panic, primal and overwhelming, erupted in her chest. She thrashed, her limbs refusing to obey, her lungs burning for air they could not have. The current caught her, a powerful, unseen hand tumbling her over and over in the crushing darkness. This is it. This is the end. Her struggles weakened. Black spots danced in her vision. Her burning lungs gave a final, desperate heave, just as her consciousness began to fray, to dissolve into the icy black. Something snagged on her tunic. It was a grip of impossible strength, an anchor in the chaos. She was being pulled up, towards a faint, shimmering light that she thought must be a hallucination, the final trick of a dying brain. She broke the surface with a choked, desperate gasp, spewing freezing water. Air, raw and painful, flooded her lungs. She was being hauled from the river, dragged onto a snow-covered bank by an immense force. She collapsed onto the ground, a shivering, sodden heap, unable to move. She could only lie there, her body convulsing with violent tremors, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would break. A shadow fell over her, a figure of impossible size, silhouetted against the swirling snow. He knelt beside her, and the sheer scale of him was terrifying. Broader than any two men she had ever seen, radiating a sense of ancient, predatory power that made the air crackle. He reached for her, and she flinched away, a pathetic, animalistic movement. A low sound rumbled in his chest. Not a word, but a sound of concern? You are freezing. His voice was deep, like the thunder of an avalanche, yet it held a strange, quiet resonance that vibrated through her bones. He was wearing dark, heavy furs, but his arm was bare where his sleeve was torn, and she saw a long, deep gash, bleeding sluggishly into the snow. He was injured. Without thinking, he began to shrug off his own massive fur cloak. No, she managed to stammer, her voice a reedy rasp. You're hurt. He paused, looking from his bleeding arm to her face. For the first time, she saw his eyes, and the breath caught in her throat. They were not normal eyes. They were the color of molten gold, glowing with a soft, internal light in the dim twilight of the storm. He seemed to look right through her skin, her bones, into the battered, hidden core of her. A strange wave of heat washed over her, chasing away a fraction of the deep-seated chill. The wound is nothing, he said, his golden eyes never leaving hers. The cold will kill you. He moved with a speed that belied his size, wrapping the enormous, impossibly warm fur cloak around her shivering body. The fur was softer than anything she had ever touched, and it smelled of pine and winter storms and something else, something uniquely him, wood smoke and strength. As he drew the cloak tight around her shoulders, his fingers brushed against the exposed skin of her neck. It was as if lightning struck her. A bolt of pure, searing heat shot through her veins, originating from that single point of contact. It was not the burn of fire, but the burn of life itself, a white, hot energy that made her entire body arch in a silent scream. A blinding light erupted behind her eyes. Images, feelings, sensations that were not her own flooded her mind. 1,000 years of loneliness, the crushing weight of a crown, the scent of ancient forests and the taste of blood on the wind. A deep, aching void, a search for something lost, something missing. She saw a throne of ice and shadow, a kingdom of silver and white. She felt the loyalty of 1,000 hearts, the burden of 1,000,000 souls. She felt a love so vast and fierce it was terrifying, a love that had been waiting for centuries, waiting for her. The vision, the feeling, the searing heat, all of it coalesced into a single point on her collarbone. The pain was excruciating, a branding iron pressing into her flesh. She cried out, a raw, ragged sound of agony and confusion. She scrambled back, away from him, crab-walking through the snow, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at him, her eyes wide with terror. What was happening? What was he? The man, the monster, remained kneeling, his expression unreadable. But his eyes had changed. The molten gold had intensified, burning with a fire that was possessive, awestruck, and utterly absolute. He slowly rose to his feet, a mountain of a man who dwarfed the landscape. The storm itself seemed to shrink in his presence. "You," he breathed, the word a plume of white in the frigid air. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration. He took a step towards her. She flinched, pulling the heavy cloak tighter around herself as if it could shield her from this overwhelming force. "Stay away from me," she whispered, the words trembling. He stopped. A strange, almost pained look crossed his harsh, predatorily beautiful features. "I have been searching," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "For so long." Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. The pain on her collarbone was subsiding into a strange, pulsing warmth. She didn't dare look. She didn't want to know. This had to be a dream, a dying hallucination brought on by the cold. It was the only thing that made sense. What are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. He looked down at his own bleeding arm, then back at her, a dawning realization in his burning gaze. He had been tracked, attacked. He had been weak, and the river had brought her to him. Fate. "I am Kale," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that shook her to her soul. "And you?" He took another step, his golden eyes fixed on the spot on her collarbone, which was now glowing with a faint silver light visible even through her tunic. "You are mine." The word hit her like a physical blow. Mine. Possessive. Absolute. It should have terrified her. A part of her was screaming, a primal fear of being owned, of being caged. She had been property her whole life, a thing to be used and discarded. But another part of her, a deep instinctual part she never knew existed, uncoiled in her chest. It was not the feeling of being owned. It was the feeling of being found, of being seen. The conflict was a dizzying, nauseating war within her. Her mind, conditioned by years of abuse, screamed danger. Her soul, awakened by his touch, whispered home. "No," she snarled, the sound shocking her. It was a weak, pathetic sound, like a kitten hissing at a wolf, but it was a snarl nonetheless, an act of defiance born of pure terror. "I belong to no one." For the first time since she'd opened her eyes, Kale's harsh features softened. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its long-sought prey, a smile of satisfaction and challenge. It was a smile that was like the sunrise after a long, dark night. "Finally," he murmured, his voice a low, pleased rumble. A challenge. He took another step, and this time she didn't scramble away. She was frozen, caught in the gravity of his presence, in the heat of his golden gaze. The world had narrowed to the space between them, the swirling snow a mere backdrop to this impossible reality. "Sit down," he said, his voice soft but leaving no room for argument. He gestured to a dry spot under an overhanging rock ledge she hadn't even noticed. "You need warmth. I will make a fire." Her body obeyed before her mind could protest. She stumbled to the spot he indicated, her legs like water. She sank down, clutching his enormous cloak around her. It smelled of him, a scent that was both terrifying and deeply comforting. She watched as he moved with an economy of motion that was brutally efficient. He ignored his own bleeding arm, gathering dry wood from the underside of fallen logs with a woodsman's ease. He struck a spark from 2 stones, and within moments, a small, hopeful fire was crackling to life. The warmth that radiated from it was a blessing, a physical thing that began to push back the bone-deep cold, but it was nothing compared to the strange, pulsing heat on her collarbone, or the inferno in his eyes as he looked at her across the flames. He finally tended to his arm, tearing a strip of cloth from his torn sleeve and binding the wound tightly. He did it all with one hand, his gaze never leaving her. "What is this?" she finally whispered, her hand hovering over her collarbone. She was afraid to touch it, afraid of the searing pain, afraid of what she would find. "It is the soul bond," he said simply, as if explaining the weather. "The mark of a fated mate, a connection I have felt, a call I have followed, for more than a century." A century. The words barely registered. Her mind couldn't grasp the scale of it. Fated mate. The words were from old stories, from legends, things that happened to beautiful, high-born she-wolves, not to filth like her. "That's impossible," she choked out. I'm an Omega. I'm nothing." The words came out automatically, the catechism of her worthless existence. His eyes flared, the gold turning to a burning amber. "Do not," he growled, the sound vibrating in the air, "ever say that again." The command was so absolute, so filled with a sudden, violent anger on her behalf, that it shocked her into silence. No one had ever been angry for her, only at her. "You are the other half of my soul," he said, his voice softening again, but losing none of its intensity. "You are the queen my kingdom has awaited. You are anything but nothing." Queen? Her? It was ludicrous, a madness born of the storm. She started to laugh, a hysterical, broken sound. Cale's expression tightened. He moved around the fire in a single, fluid motion, kneeling in front of her again. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push aside the collar of her ragged tunic. She flinched but didn't pull away. She had to see. She had to know. In the flickering firelight, she saw it. On the pale skin of her collarbone, a mark was etched, as if by a master artist. It was a complex, beautiful knot of silver lines, swirling and weaving together to form the shape of a howling wolf's head crowned with a single radiant star. It pulsed with a soft internal light, a living piece of magic on her skin. It was beautiful. And it was a brand, a claim. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and painful. Tears of terror, of confusion, of a desperate, terrifying hope that she was too afraid to acknowledge. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why the sun rises? Why the moon waxes and wanes?" He answered, his voice a deep murmur. "It simply is. It is destiny, Alara." He knew her name. How could he know her name? She had never told him. As if reading her thoughts, he touched his own temple. "The bond. It opens a path. I know your name. I know your pain. And I will burn the world to the ground for every moment of it you have suffered." The sheer, raw protectiveness in his voice was overwhelming. It was a shield she had never known, a promise of vengeance for wounds no one had ever even acknowledged. It was too much. She shook her head, pulling her tunic back into place, hiding the mark. "You are mistaken. It's a mistake." "It is not a mistake," he said, his voice firm. He sat back on his heels, giving her space. "You are exhausted, frightened. Sleep. I will keep watch." Sleep? How could she possibly sleep in the presence of this king, this ancient being who claimed her as his own? But her body was betraying her. The warmth of the fire, the heavy comfort of his cloak, and the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion from her ordeal were conspiring against her. Her eyelids felt like lead weights, and beneath her fear, there was that strange instinctual hum, the part of her that recognized the truth in his words, the part of her that felt, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly safe. Her last waking thought was of his golden eyes, watching her from across the fire, a guardian in the heart of the storm. She woke to the smell of roasting meat. The fire was a bed of glowing coals, and Kale was turning a spit with 2 plump rabbits on it. The storm had lessened, the wind a low moan instead of a scream. He had let her sleep. He had hunted for them. He hadn't hurt her. "You're awake," he said, not looking at her. He pulled one of the rabbits from the spit and offered it to her. She took it, her stomach rumbling with a hunger so sharp it was a physical pain. She ate, tearing at the hot, juicy meat with a ravenousness that would have shamed her back at the lodge. Here, with him, there was no shame. There was only survival. He watched her eat, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of her eating. "The Stonefang pack will be looking for you," he said finally. Alara froze, the meat halfway to her lips. "They won't," she said bitterly. "They sent me out here to die." His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. "They will," he corrected her, his voice flat and cold as ice. "Because my envoy is there, and they will know that their Alpha King was attacked in their territory. They will search, pretending to look for me, and they will find my trail. Our trail." Fear, cold and familiar, returned. "What will they do?" "They will try to use you," he said, his golden eyes meeting hers. "They will see you as a weakness, a pawn to be played against me." Her heart sank. A pawn. A tool. It was all she had ever been. For a few brief hours she had felt different. But here it was again. Her worth was only in relation to someone else. "We must leave," Kale continued, rising to his feet. "My kingdom is 3 days' ride north. My guards will be searching. We must meet them before anyone else finds us." He stamped out the fire, burying the coals in the snow. He was all business now, the brief softness from the night before replaced by the grim focus of a king at war. He helped her to her feet, his touch firm but impersonal on her arm. But even that brief contact sent a jolt of warmth through her, a reminder of the impossible connection that now hummed beneath her skin. They traveled for hours. Kale moved at a relentless pace, but he was always aware of her, slowing when her breath grew ragged, creating a path for her through the deep snow. The bond was a strange, silent conversation between them. She could feel his strength, his determination, and beneath it all, a constant, thrumming awareness of her. It was late in the afternoon when they heard the howls. Kale stopped instantly, his head tilting, his entire body going rigid. "Scouts," he growled, "not mine." He pushed her behind him, shielding her with his body. He drew a massive, wicked-looking hunting knife from his belt. His golden eyes scanned the trees, narrowed and lethal. They emerged from the woods like wraiths, 4 large wolves, their fur the color of granite, stone-fang wolves. And behind them, a man shifted back to his 2-legged form. Fendrel. Fendrel's eyes widened when he saw Kale. He dropped into a low, respectful bow. "Alpha King," he said, his voice strained. We were searching for you. We feared you were lost in the storm." Kale did not relax his stance. "Did you?" he said, his voice a low threat. Fendrel's gaze flickered past Kale to where Alara was hiding. His eyes narrowed. Then he saw the corner of Kale's heavy fur cloak wrapped around her, and his expression shifted from feigned respect to cunning speculation. "And you found our Omega," Fendrel said smoothly. "She ran off in the storm. We were worried for her." The lie was so bald, so effortless, it made Alara's stomach turn. "She did not run off," Kale stated, his voice dropping another 10 degrees. "She was sent out to die." Fendrel's face paled. "A misunderstanding, Your Majesty." He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Alara. He was trying to get a better look. "Come, Omega," Fendrel ordered, his voice returning to its usual tone of command when he spoke to her. "You will return with us. You have caused enough trouble." Alara shrank back, pressing herself against Kale's broad back. His presence was a solid wall of heat and power. "She is not going anywhere," Kale said, his voice final. It was then that Fendrel saw it. As Alara shifted, the collar of her tunic dipped, and for a split second, the silver mark on her collarbone caught the light. A sharp intake of breath. Fendrel's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed into a look of pure, greedy avarice. He had seen it. He understood. He took a slow step back, his hand subtly gesturing to the wolves flanking him. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, his voice slick with false deference. "My apologies." But his eyes told a different story. They were filled with calculation. He looked at Alara not as a person, but as a prize, a key, a weapon to be seized. "Leave," Kale commanded. Fendrel bowed again and retreated into the woods, his wolves melting away with him. But Alara knew. This wasn't over. "He saw the mark," she whispered, her voice tight with dread. "I know," Kale said, his back still rigid. "They will report to their alpha, and their alpha will report to his true master." "True master?" she asked, confused. "Lyra's father?" Kale finally turned to her, his expression grim. "No. The Stonefang Alpha is a dog on a leash held by a Shadow King who calls himself Morgrath. He leads a cult, the Ember Covenant, and has been trying to usurp my throne for decades. He was the one whose assassins attacked me before the storm." The pieces clicked into place. The attack on Kale, her being sent out to die. It wasn't a coincidence. "They will come for you now," Kale said, his golden eyes burning with a cold fire. "They will try to take you from me, and I will kill anyone who touches you." His promise, meant to be comforting, sent a chill of fear down her spine. A war was coming, and she was standing at its heart. They pressed on, moving faster now, a palpable urgency humming in the air. Cale barely spoke, his focus entirely on their surroundings, his senses stretched to their limits. Alara could feel his tension through the bond, a tight coil of readiness and restrained violence. The sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and blood. They needed to find shelter. Cale was scanning a ridge ahead when he suddenly stiffened. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ambush. Before she could even process the word, the world exploded into chaos. Dark figures swarmed from the trees, silent and swift. They were not wolves. They were men, clad in black leather and steel, their faces hidden by shadowy cowls. The Ember Covenant. And with them was Fendrel, his face a mask of triumphant malice. Cale roared, a sound of pure, untamed fury that was not entirely human. He shoved Alara behind a thicket of firs. "Stay down!" He met their charge head-on, his hunting knife a blur of motion. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of death and destruction. For every one of his assailants, he was worth 3, his movements a brutal dance of strength and precision. But there were too many. Alara watched in horror as they swarmed him, their blades flashing. She felt a sharp stabbing pain in her own side as a sword scored a deep cut along Cale's ribs. The bond was a conduit for his pain, a phantom agony that made her cry out. Fendrel ignored the fight. His eyes were only for her. He lunged, grabbing her arm in a brutal grip. "You're coming with me, little prize." She screamed, thrashing against him, but he was too strong. He began to drag her away from the fight, back into the dark woods. "Cale!" she shrieked, her voice raw with terror. At her cry, Cale's head snapped up. His eyes, burning with golden fury, met hers across the clearing. He saw Fendrel dragging her away, and his roar of rage shook the very trees. He fought with renewed, desperate ferocity, trying to break through the circle of attackers to get to her. But a heavy chain, thrown like a whip, wrapped around his legs, bringing him to one knee. Another wrapped around his arms, pinning them. They were silver chains, magic-dampening silver. The moment the silver touched him, a wave of nauseating weakness washed over Alara. The bond, their connection, flickered and dimmed like a dying flame. The warmth in her chest turned into a cold, aching void. It was like a part of her soul was being ripped away. She saw Cale struggle against the chains, his muscles straining, his face a mask of agony and rage. But the silver was potent. It was draining his immense power. "Don't worry about him," Fendrel sneered, yanking her harder. "Lord Morgrath has special plans for you." She was dragged into the darkness. The last thing she saw was Cale, on his knees, entangled in silver, his golden eyes locked on her, filled with a promise of bloody retribution. Then the trees swallowed her whole. The journey was a nightmare. They bound her hands with silver-laced ropes that felt like ice and fire against her skin, further dampening the bond. The aching void in her chest became a constant physical pain. It felt like she was being hollowed out from the inside. She was taken to a hidden fortress, a grim place of black stone and sharp angles built into the side of a desolate mountain. It felt dead, the very air thick with dark, stagnant magic. They threw her into a cell. It was small, damp, and utterly black. The door slammed shut, the sound of the bolt echoing with a dreadful finality. She was alone, truly alone. The faint connection to Cale was almost gone, just a tiny, flickering ember in a universe of cold darkness. All her old feelings came rushing back, a suffocating tide of worthlessness and despair. Kale had been wrong. She wasn't a queen. She was a curse, a weakness. She had gotten him captured, hurt. It was all her fault. She curled into a ball on the cold stone floor, the silver ropes biting into her wrists, and for the first time since Lyra had tripped her, she wept. Silent, despairing tears for a hope she had been foolish enough to entertain. Hours, or maybe days, passed. She lost track of time in the disorienting darkness. They gave her bread and water, just enough to keep her alive. Then, the door opened. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, radiating an aura of cold, confident power that was a sickening parody of Kale's strength. He was tall and unnaturally thin, with a pale, handsome face that was marred by the cruelty in his eyes. "So," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, like a snake slithering over silk. "This is the creature that has the great Alpha King so distracted. Morgrath, the Shadow King." He entered the cell, his presence sucking the warmth from the air. He circled her like a shark, his eyes dissecting her. "Hardly impressive," he mused. "Filthy, malnourished. Just another stray Omega. What does he see in you?" He crouched down, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. His touch was cold, like a corpse's. "Ah," he whispered, his eyes finding the faint outline of the mark on her collarbone. "There it is. The key." She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Do you know what this is, little thing?" he asked conversationally. "It is the potential for a bond of immense power. A bond meant to unite our kind, to create a dynasty. But a bond, like any lock, can be picked. Its power can be redirected." He smiled, a chilling, bloodless expression. "Kale thinks this bond makes him stronger. Instead, it has given me his greatest weakness, you. With you as the focal point, I will perform a ritual. I will not break the bond, oh no. I will sever his connection to it and graft my own in its place. All that power, all that history, all that destiny will be mine. I will be the true Alpha King, and he will be a hollow, powerless shell." His words were a physical blow. He wasn't going to kill her. He was going to use her to destroy Kale, to hollow him out, just as she felt hollowed out now. It was a fate worse than death. "You are nothing but a tool, a vessel for my ascension," he finished, releasing her chin with a contemptuous flick. He stood up, dusting off his hands as if he had touched something unclean. "Prepare her for the ritual." He swept out of the cell, leaving her in the crushing darkness with his poisonous words echoing in her mind. A tool, a vessel, nothing. Despair washed over her, black and absolute. He was right. That's all she was, all she had ever been. She had brought ruin upon the one person who had ever looked at her and seen something more. She pressed her face against the cold, damp stone, her spirit broken. The last ember of the bond flickered, about to be extinguished forever. "Hold on." The voice was not a sound. It was a thought, a feeling, a thread of warmth in the freezing void. It was faint, strained, but it was unmistakably him. Alara's head shot up. She pressed her hands to her temples, straining to find the connection. "I am coming." The voice was stronger this time, a raw promise of violence and rescue that cut through the despair. It was Kale. He was alive. He was fighting. For her. A tiny, impossible seed of hope planted itself in the barren wasteland of her heart. He hadn't given up. He was coming. She would not give up either. She would hold on. The guards came for her. They dragged her from the cell up winding stone stairs into a vast circular chamber. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and something acrid, like burning blood. The room was dominated by a huge, intricate circle carved into the floor, glowing with a malevolent red light. Morgrath stood in the center, his arms raised, chanting in a guttural language that made her skin crawl. They forced her onto a stone altar in the middle of the circle, chaining her down with more of the agonizing silver. The red light of the runes intensified, feeding on her fear, her pain. "The ritual begins," Morgrath declared, his voice booming in the chamber. "Tonight, a new king rises." The pain started as a low hum, a vibration that resonated with the silver chains. It grew steadily, becoming a sharp, piercing agony that seemed to be tearing her soul apart. The bond, the beautiful, warm connection to Kale, was being twisted, corrupted. She could feel him through it, feel his own agony as Morgrath's dark magic assaulted their link. She screamed, a long, tearing sound of pure torment. It was at that moment that the entire fortress shook. A tremendous boom echoed from below, like the fist of a god striking the mountain. A section of the chamber wall exploded inward, showering the room with stone and dust. Through the newly created opening, framed by fire and ruin, stood Kale. He was no longer the injured man from the forest. He was the Alpha King in his full, terrifying glory. His golden eyes were blazing infernos of pure rage. He was covered in dust and blood, not his own. And at his back were his elite warriors, the Winter Guard, their eyes glowing with silver light, their forms a blur of fur and claws as they engaged the Covenant soldiers. "Morgrath!" Kale's roar was the sound of an avalanche, a promise of utter annihilation. Morgrath turned, his face a mask of fury at the interruption. "Impossible! You were chained!" "Your silver was an inconvenience," Kale snarled, taking a step into the room. His gaze found Alara on the altar, and his rage intensified into something Nova hot. "But no chain can hold me from my mate." He charged, a blur of motion, but Morgrath was prepared. He threw up a shield of black energy, and Kale slammed into it with the force of a battering ram. The shield held, but barely. "You are too late, old wolf," Morgrath cackled, turning his attention back to the ritual. He began chanting faster, pouring more power into the circle. The pain in Alara became unbearable. It was a fire, a void, a tearing, shredding agony that was destroying her. She could feel Kale's strength being siphoned away, feeding the dark magic. She could feel him weakening. Through the bond, she felt his desperation, his fear. Not for himself, but for her. And in that moment, something inside her broke. It was not her spirit. It was the dam she had built around her heart, the cage where she had locked away a lifetime of pain, fear, and rage. It was the lie that she was worthless. Seeing Kale, her mate, her king, the only person who had ever seen her, faltering because of her, it was a pain greater than any ritual, and it ignited a fury that was hotter than any sun. No. The word was not a thought. It was a detonation. A light erupted from her, a pure, blinding white light that had nothing to do with Morgrath's corrupted magic. It was the light of a newborn star, the light of creation itself. It vaporized the silver chains, shattering them into dust. It blasted outward in a concussive wave, a silent scream of pure power. The wave of light slammed into the Covenant soldiers, and they simply dissolved. It washed over the Winter Guard, and their wounds knitted closed, their strength surging. It struck Kale, and he roared as the last of the silver's poison was burned away, his power returning tenfold. The red runes of the ritual circle flickered and died, consumed by the pure, holy light. Alara rose from the altar. She was no longer the shivering, terrified Omega. She was floating an inch off the ground, her hair whipping around her as if in a private gale. Her eyes were no longer the color of a winter sky, but twin pools of brilliant, liquid starlight. The mark on her collarbone blazed with a light so bright it was painful to look at. Power, raw and untamed, poured from her. The power of life, the power of healing, the power of light itself. The hidden queen was hidden no more. Morgrath stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. What are you? She turned her head, her starlit eyes pinning him in place. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper, it was a chorus, a symphony of power that resonated in the very stones of the fortress. They called me worthless, she said, the voice echoing with the pain of 1,000 cuts. They called me filth. You called me a key. She took a step towards him, the stone floor cracking under her feet. I am not worthless. I am not a key, she declared, her voice rising with triumphant rage. I am the other half of the Alpha King. I am the light that devours the shadows. I am your end. She raised a hand, and a spear of pure white light formed in her palm. Morgrath screamed, a pathetic, terrified sound, and threw up another black shield. The spear of light hit the shield, and for a moment, the two forces battled, a maelstrom of light and shadow. But there was no contest. The darkness was consumed, eaten away, annihilated by the purity of her power. The light struck Morgrath. He did not cry out. He simply ceased to be, his form dissolving into motes of dust that were then burned away into nothing. Silence descended on the chamber. The battle was over. The light around Alara softened, receding back into her until only her eyes still glowed with starlight. She swayed, the immense expenditure of power hitting her all at once. Before she could fall, strong arms were around her. Kale held her, his grip tight, reverent. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a tremor run through his massive frame. Alara, he breathed, his voice thick with awe and a profound, soul-shaking love. She leaned against him, her strength gone, and looked up into his face. His golden eyes were bright with unshed tears. He was looking at her as if she were the most precious, powerful, and beautiful thing in all of creation. I have you, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. You have me, she whispered back, and for the first time, the words felt right. They felt like a promise, not a prison. He gently touched the blazing mark on her collarbone. The light flared, warm and comforting. My queen, he said, his voice full of wonder. She reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it over his heart. She felt the steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. She closed her eyes, focusing on the bond, on the connection that was now thrumming between them, clean and brighter than ever before. She didn't just accept the bond now, she claimed it. She poured her own will into it, her love, her fierce, newfound strength. She claimed him, just as he had claimed her. A soft gasp escaped his lips. A new mark, a mirror of her own, bloomed into existence over his heart, a soft silver glow visible even through his tunic. The bond was complete, a union of two sovereigns, equal and absolute. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, cradled against his chest, wrapped in his strength. Alara felt a sense of peace settle over her for the first time in her life. A sense of belonging. She was home. The journey to Kale's kingdom, the Argent Vale, was a stark contrast to her flight through the wilderness. They rode on the back of Kale's own werewolf, a magnificent beast the size of a pony with fur like spun moonlight. Tucked safely in front of him, shielded from the wind by his body, she finally saw the world not as a threat, but as a wonder. They arrived at the capital city, Silverwood, at dawn. It was a city carved from a frozen waterfall and nestled in a valley of ancient snow-dusted pines. Towers of ice and white stone scraped the sky, glowing with a soft internal light that reminded her of her own newfound power. It was beautiful, majestic, and terrifying. Thousands of people, werewolves in their human forms, their eyes all shades of silver, gold, and blue, lined the main thoroughfare. They had come to welcome their king home, and to see the woman he brought with him. Fear, a familiar old ghost, whispered in her ear. They would see the Omega, the filth. They would reject her. Kale must have felt her anxiety through the bond. He tightened his arm around her, his voice a low rumble against her ear. You are their queen, Alara. They see your light. They already love you. As they dismounted before the great ice-carved citadel, the crowd fell silent. All eyes were on her. But the stares were not like the ones she was used to. There was no contempt, no mockery. There was awe, wonder, respect. Kale led her up the sweeping steps of the citadel, his hand firmly in hers. He did not stop until they stood on the high balcony overlooking the entire city. His winter guard formed a silent, formidable line behind them. He turned to face his people, his voice amplified by a magic that carried it across the entire valley. People of the Argent Vale! For a century, our kingdom has been strong, but incomplete. I have ruled alone, waiting for the other half of my soul. Today, the wait is over. He drew Alara forward, turning her to face the crowd. He raised their joined hands high. Behold, Alara, your Queen Luna, she who is my fated mate, she who holds the heart of the stars within her, she who is the light that will guard our future. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Then, a single wolf howled, a long, joyous cry. It was joined by another and another, until the air was filled with a symphony of 1,000 howls, a chorus of welcome and acceptance that washed over Alara, cleansing the last of her old wounds. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the kingdom of silver and white that was now her home, at the man beside her, her king, her mate, who looked at her with a love so profound it was a physical force. The tears that came this time were not of sorrow or fear. They were tears of joy, of release. She was not worthless. She was not invisible. She was Alara, the hidden queen, the soul healer, the mate of the Alpha King. She was home, and she would never be alone again.